welcome to this first panel. We are elaborating now on this maybe surprising title, M&A and the Geography of Innovative Firms. And this panel actually comes from a suggestion of Nicolas on the importance of geography when it comes to M&A activities. And we have this very interesting paper from Adrian Matre, who is a visiting professor at Harvard University. And to talk about this paper and the consequences to be drawn from this paper in terms of enforcement of competition laws, we are lucky enough to have with us Ben Schroeter, Ben is Director of Economic and Policy and Strategic Engagement at Booking.com. Luc Soete is Emeritus Professor at Maastricht University. And online we have Willem Boshoff, who is Professor at Stellenbosch University. So I turn my eyes towards Carla. Do we have Willem online?
Good morning. I can hear you.
He's online. Okay.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for inviting me to present this research.
Oh, maybe you could stop the... Okay, so I have to explain. So Adrian is not with us, but we have a recording of his voice explaining slides about his paper. So we thought it could be a very good way to set the stage for the discussion. So now you can play this slideshow. And you have to be very
Everybody, thanks so much
patient
for inviting me to present this research. And let me first apologize for not being able to be with you in person. Unfortunately, I had a small health incident that forced me to stay in the US. But let me jump right into the talk. So the motivation in this research is an example that we see regularly where a large firm wants to acquire a European startup. So for instance, recently, Apple mentioned that they wanted to acquire Mistral, a leading French AI startup. And given that Apple is lagging in AI, it seems quite likely that they will want to consolidate at least some of the talent and bring back the research activity that was initially done in Paris to Cupertino. So should we really worry about that? Maybe because this will not just be about Mistral. It is also about potentially every innovative firms and every researcher in Paris that benefits from the existence of Mistral innovation right now. So this idea was made forcefully by Nicolas in a recent FT column, where he argues that when research-driven companies leave an innovation cluster, they take with them the knowledge spillovers that diffuse to local organizations and the informal exchanges that spread ideas. So to what extent should we take into account the potential loss of those knowledge spillovers when thinking about the possible negative effects of cross-border M&As? And so the central question that I want to discuss today is precisely what does the economic evidence tells us about these local spillovers and what should measure review do about them. So in theory, why should we care? Well, let's start with a few anchor firms in the center of an innovative cluster. And so those anchor firms are going to produce innovation. This innovation means that there are more ideas being generated, and those ideas are going to diffuse locally, producing what we call knowledge spillovers. Concretely, those spillovers make it easier for surrounding firms to innovate as well in response, which generate more innovation in the cluster. This additional innovation means that the return to investment increase, which likely attracts additional capital into the cluster. And this additional capital is going to fund more research that will amplify the spillovers further and the whole ecosystem is going to grow. So this whole virtuous circle, in theory, depends on the presence of those innovative anchor firms at the center of the cluster. Remove the anchor and potentially the whole mechanism and the whole system unravel. But is it verified empirically? So this is what I want to talk about today. So in a recent research, I was able to address a question that is not exactly the context of M&A, but has a setting that is pretty similar. So what I did concretely is I compared the amount of innovation made by surrounding firms in what I call a treated clusters. So in these clusters, the anchor firm experienced a change in the amount of innovation its lab produces locally for reasons that are completely unrelated to the local economic conditions in which this cluster is located. So think, for instance, there is an out-of-state regulation shock that comes from, say, Delaware, and that affects the lab of a firm in Minnesota. And so I'm going to compare what happens to those surrounding firms that are indirectly affected by the shock that is affecting the anchor firm. And I compare the innovation produced by those firms with the innovation of the firms that are around a different anchor firm, one that did not experience any shock. And so by comparing the treated cluster with the control cluster, I could quantify the existence and the magnitude of those spillovers. So the main point I want to leave you with, if there is one idea that you should remember, is that innovation spillovers are real, they are large, and they are local. So what I found is that there is a roughly a 0.2 elasticity, which means that when the large firm's patent change by 1%, there is a change in the similar direction by nearby firms of 0.2%. So this is a 20% pass-through, which is pretty large in the literature. These spillovers are also incredibly local. So if you look at surrounding firms in the same area, meaning firms within 40 miles, those spillovers are very strong. If you look at nearby firms that are between 40 and 100 miles, the spillover already fades away quite a bit, but they are still positive. Finally, if you look at firms that are more than 100 miles away, there is basically no spillover whatsoever. So that naturally raises the question, why do those spillovers happen and why are they so local? So I identify three channels. The first one is worker mobility. So the knowledge that is produced by the anchor firm diffuses locally simply because skilled workers tend to move quite a bit across firms. But because they live in only one place, they're going to move across firms located in the same region. And when they move, they're going to carry the knowledge they have acquired at their previous employers with them. The second type of spillover is the existence of spin-out, the formation of spin-outs. So employees leave the anchor firm to start their own ventures, seeding the local ecosystem with inherited expertise and networks. Finally, I find empirical evidence for the existence of this financing virtuous circle I mentioned before, which is that spillovers attract out of cluster capital into the cluster, so attract capital from outside the area. And this availability of capital will amplify the spillovers even further, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. So one natural question nowadays is, should we still care about that in the age of virtual interaction? After all, I'm talking to you all the way from the US right now without being present in the same room. So research in economics has produced a few interesting results. First, we found that if anything, the importance of local spillovers have increased over the 80s. And that has to do with the fact that face-to-face meetings between workers happen at nearby firms. And that is one of the key channels of knowledge diffusion. The other reason is that the financing channel cannot really work remotely. This is because we have good evidence that the financing of innovation is much more efficient when the financiers are close to the entrepreneurs they are funding. So with that background in mind, what happens when a merger relocates R&D? Well, think of two cases. Before the merger, you have a healthy European cluster with anchor firms producing all the spillovers we talked about before. After the merger, there is a risk of hollowing out. The anchor firm that is being acquired gets relocated to a different country. Because it is relocated, you face a direct loss of spillovers. Worker mobility collapses simply because you have fewer skilled workers who can circulate. And the absorption capacity of the whole cluster erodes. So this is the second big concept I want to emphasize today. This existence of a hidden multiplier produced by what we call absorptive capacity. So you should think of R&D as serving two dual purposes. The standard one is that it generates new knowledge, innovation that produces spillover, as I just described. But R&D also builds the capacity to absorb the production of future knowledge. This absorptive capacity can have very large effect. If you compare places with bigger absorptive capacity to others, you find that the spillovers produced are an order of twice as large. And because absorptive capacity is a stock variable, once it is depleted, it is very hard to rebuild. So what that means is that the merger that relocates R&D does not just remove a flow of ideas, it degrades the whole ecosystem's ability to process ideas from any source in the future. So what are the implications for EU merger review? Right now, merger review focuses on market power and consumer prices, and it doesn't systematically account for geographic externalities of relocating R&D. The economic research I described suggests three things. First, we should assess the risk of relocation when reviewing acquisitions of innovative European firms by foreign acquirers. Second, we should consider the spillover losses to the local ecosystem, not just the effects of the merging parties. And third, we should design appropriate remedies if we accept the M&A, for instance, by conditioning the approval on maintaining local R&D activities and monitoring post-merger research employment. So, in summary, innovation spillovers are real, large, and very local. They sustain dynamic innovation clusters by generating three virtuous circles. The innovation spillover loop, where innovation produces spillovers that produces more innovation. The spillover financing loop, where spillovers increase the return to capital that attracts more capital that then provide more capital availability that amplifies the spillovers. And finally, the spillover absorptive capacity loop, where more spillover increases the stock of knowledge that allows the cluster to absorb more knowledge in the future, thereby producing more spillover. Cross-border measures that relocate R&D can break each of these circles. And a crucial idea to keep in mind is that those damages can compound over time. And so we should not only think about the loss of spillovers at a given time, but also all the losses about the future spillovers that might have happened. Therefore, EU major review should incorporate geographic innovation activity externalities when thinking about whether or not they want to approve a merger. Thank you very much. If you have any question, feel free to reach out via email. I would be delighted to continue this talk, this discussion. And again, I am so sorry I cannot be with you today.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a recording. Adrian is not actually here, but do we have Willem with us? Carla, is he here? Is he online?
Yes,
Yes,
I'm
he
here.
is. Willem, can you say hi so we make sure you can hear us?
Hi, everyone.
Okay, you're here.
Right.
So this paper is fascinating, and I also have to say that this panel is inspired by a column in the FT written by Nicola, where he elaborates on the situation where, given that Apple is lagged in the race for AI, they would have an incentive to acquire Mistral AI. So what do we have to lose if Apple acquires Mistral AI and then relocates the activities of Mistral AI in the United States? So I would like to start this conversation with Ben, Willem, and Luc, elaborating on this, the main point of the paper. Does geography matters when it comes to M&A activity? Should we take into account this kind of parameter when we assess the legality of a merger? That will be the second question. And then we will open the discussion, and I'm sure Emanuele has very good input and maybe elements to integrate in the current revision of the merger guidelines. So the first question, maybe to Ben, do you think that geography matters? Do you think that innovation clusters are a real phenomenon that we have to take into account? What's your experience on that? And do you think that the claim of Adrian is robust in practice, in real life?
Sure, happy to comment on that. So I'm going to bring in a bit of a practical perspective before we get to the implications or potential implications for merger control. And I'm going to use the example of Booking.com, which is one of the largest European tech companies. What many people might not know is founded in 1996 in the Netherlands as a company that was specializing in fax technology, which was cutting edge at the time. And our founder connected mass fax technologies to the internet. So basically, you could go, there was a website. It was mainly populated by Amsterdam hotels. You could make a reservation, and technically, we would send a fax to the hotel to confirm the reservation. They would send a fax back. It would run through an OCR, and then it would enter into a database. That worked for a while, but then as internet technology got more mature, this was not cutting edge anymore. And so a few years later, Booking acquired a UK-based company, Active Hotels, which was leading in e-commerce technologies, and brought them into, which was at the time called Bookings NL, and then rebranded as Booking.com. And this was really the nucleus to scale this technology. And I think if you look at Amsterdam today, which is one of the major tech hubs in Europe, you will see that it's very much focused on e-commerce and payments. And I think you can trace this back to this decision, because this was really when cutting edge expertise was brought into Amsterdam, and it was kind of the nucleus for this innovation cluster. You can then also see how, as Booking got bigger and itself invested more in research, that more and more of this innovation spilled over into other companies. So today we are the third largest R&D investor in the Netherlands and the #1 investor in AI. And just this year, the Financial Times commissioned an analysis and produced a ranking of which companies are basically the leading founder foundries. So they're looking at the top 250 companies in Europe in terms of whose alumni have gone on to found other companies. And Booking is number 12 on that list. And if you look at the geographic concentration of this founding activity, it's very much in the Netherlands. So I think this speaks very much to Adrian's paper, that these innovation spillovers are very localized. I think you can also see it in the location choice that we make as a company. I mean, there are very clear patterns. We're headquartered in Amsterdam, but other locations where we have a major footprint, such as Tel Aviv or Berlin, are equally tech hotspots. And that's not a coincidence, because we need access to a certain talent pool, and you need a certain density of exactly the kind of capabilities that we're looking for. So I think there are some just looking at the example of Booking.com, I think these are like very practical implications and confirmations of what we see in Adrian's paper. So maybe one last comment on Emanuele's presentation and gigafactories, because I think this is related to this topic. I was involved in the evaluation of, we were approached by some of the consortia in the Netherlands to join the gigafactory bids. And I was involved in evaluating these consortia. And I'm really concerned that you don't find any leading companies in these consortia. And I don't think that's a coincidence. Because if you look at what they're trying to achieve, it's way below what is commercially available in the market today. And also about the location choice. I mean, I'm just familiar with the Netherlands, but if you look at like where these gigafactories are supposed to be built, it's basically in the middle of nowhere. There's no local talent pool. There's no connection to AI ecosystems or anything. So I would be very skeptical in awarding these kind of grants to consortia that have no connection to these innovation clusters, because I think you will have a very hard time attracting people, and you will have a very hard time creating exactly the kind of spillovers that we're discussing today.
Thank you, Ben. Willem, may I ask you to comment on 2 points? My first question is it only a matter of geography, or to a larger extent, a matter of ecosystems? And in other words, do innovation clusters emerge from a friendly environment where geography would be one of the parameters, among others? And my second question is, if I may, is geography really relevant in a digital world where interactions are not really physical, territorial ones? And because Adrian addresses this point in the paper, so I would like to have your comment on that. So first point, are we talking about ecosystems or only geography?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that. I think, for me, the ecosystem concept is a broader concept, and it has a specific basis that has been established in competition policy in the EU and elsewhere. So I would think that the ecosystem concept would be something that is easier to almost incorporate in an innovation arm for merger control assessment, and that the ecosystem concept has a geographic dimension, of course, and one might want to elevate that if your concern is just with innovation. But it seems to me a concept that is potentially more useful to us if we are in the merger control world than say something like a cluster, which has, so the difficulties here, we're trying to capture these cross-market effects, but you really have the problem of how do you maintain or coordinate the different analyses between competition, innovation, and other goals that you might have. So it seems if you proliferate the different concepts, you're going to run into some trouble. So I think the ecosystem concept can be usefully refined here. And then, of course, as has been mentioned, one would have to think how geography plays into other concepts like dynamic capabilities. I mean, is there a geographic basis for how a merger affects the dynamic capability, supposedly, of the merged entity? So I think one should be quite a bit of more thinking would need to go into how these different terms apply. Well, so does geography matter? Well, so let me give you one perspective at least from an African perspective. Of course, I'm situated, for those that don't know, close to Cape Town, where there is a relatively live tech scene, tech industry, startups, and a smaller cluster in Johannesburg and some of it in Kenya as well. But I mean, it really matters with where the tech firms are focused. I mean, if we're talking about kind of AI type firms, perhaps the geography matters less. But if you're thinking about the types of tech firms that have been quite successful here, which are online intermediation platforms like the booking.coms of the world, but e-commerce and the like, there the geography actually plays quite a big role. So it's not the case, for example, that Amazon, which is a huge e-commerce player, could make headway easily in many African countries, and because of the need to traverse a lot of geographic, local, logistical, other types of constraints or challenges that maybe don't apply in the US or in European markets. So so geography can actually shape how the geographic peculiarities can actually shape how a competition and therefore maybe innovation also plays out in the different jurisdictions.
Even in the digital world, right? Geography still matters.
Yeah.
Luke, may I gather your comments on the paper, and maybe on one point, I think it might be interesting to compare the situation in the United States with the situation in Europe. So far, I don't think we have a Silicon Valley in Europe. Do we think we should build one? But you have slides. Maybe, Carla, if we can show the slides of Luke, if you want to use it. Thank you.
Thanks very much. No, I first of all, it's a delight to be here, but I'm always amazed about talking about innovation. I would have invited Philips to do the audio of this office. I don't know how you manage this, Nicolas, to listen and to hear the sound as it should here, because there's a bit of resonance, as we would say, in this room. So I hope you can understand me. I think this is a fascinating topic, and unfortunately, I focused very much on the paper of Adrian, which was circulated, and Nicolas' response. And basically what he presented responds more or less to all my observations and my comments I had prepared. So let me just, I think this is why this is particularly fascinating, is because the whole issue about, Europe is very different. And I think Emmanuel's presentation highlighted this, but insufficiently highlighted the feature you're talking about, the supranational unit as compared to the US. And this raises still some fundamental issues about the first point I would make, Emmanuel, is that as you put it in the paper with Romana Gona, is the single market in services in this virtual world is absolutely essential. It's a prerequisite for any of the industrial policies being launched. And I think I would argue this is both for sustainability, the energy union, as well as for the digital union, and the lack that we don't have in these two areas. We don't have single markets, and hence by definition, you can, we've put it in another paper, you can invest in R&D and industrial policies. The more you want, the effectiveness of those policies is like to be very small because of the lack of the, if you talk about your energy prices, I live in Maastricht on the border city with Belgium. The cross-border transport of energy is not existent, and it's continuously locked to the fact that we lack this kind of energy union. So this was the first point that I really wanted to make. But clearly, with respect to both areas, sustainability and the digital agenda, the local environment is essential. I would argue that the fundamental mistake made in the European Green Deal was not to include the local dimension. And the local dimension is hugely different between, purely in physical terms, between land areas, mountain areas, sea areas, drought areas, areas of flooding, etc., in terms of the appropriate policies with respect to sustainability. This missing element, we've called this in a report for the Joint Research Center, the Square, which was really comparing it to the movie The Square, highlighting the importance of the local dimensions for capability developments and for interactions with local communities, particularly with respect to issues such as green tech and sustainability. And lacking those, again, the Draghi report missed the local dimension completely. And again, because of this, you miss the discontent of regions, the link between sustainability and regional discontent, as it has emerged over the last, since the Gilets jaunes, so to say. And each time you find, and this is why we finished this now in a report, again, published last month, Capitalism, Sustainability and Democracy, as a paraphrasing of Schroeter, to highlight this interaction between these three features and how the lack of sustainability and the local dimension is actually leading you to an undermining of democracy in Europe at the moment. This is the sort of core message in this. I just wanted to get this out of my, my mind here. So why is the location issues? And I think Nicolas' piece is interesting, fascinating. The two questions I have is this because of the digital sector? And I would be tempted, certainly here, having heard Adrian just a minute ago on the virtual nature, I would say yes, primarily because, as Brian, who's unfortunately not here, would highlight, the network effects there are so important that this is really an issue where the issue about dominance in terms of economies of scale at the world level are becoming dominant, so to say, and where Europe has been failing primarily. And you can find also that this issue of the digital sector is behind the Draghi report, which is really on a digital innovation gap. And is it specific to the recent period? And this is where Adrian, I was going to criticize Adrian of the period 75-2000, which is the old period, but everything looked, at least from the European side, happy and beautiful, etc., and is very different from the current period. So as he corrected this in the sense that his presentation, I will skip this. But let me give you two clear examples. So this is not, yep, sorry. I'm going too fast. So this is really where I wanted to, there is an interesting paper I certainly would like Nicolas and Bo and David to look at, and there's the recent paper which was published by Max Herbertson, Neil Lee, Martina Pardy, David Soskic, and Michael Storper, who provide a lot of evidence on the geographical dimension of Europe's failed, what they call the political economy of Europe's first mover innovation deficit. It's a fascinating paper because it highlights in all areas the size of the European hubs, the European ecosystems compared to the US, the geographical dimensions related to this, the various aspects about the labor market with respect to, again, a feature of how do you attract skilled labor? We are probably, most of us are here are immigrants in a certain way as academics, but this is very, very, very specific to the academic community. It's very different from the, say, the high-skilled community, where still Europe is very much a disaggregated, segmented labor market, etc. I won't go into this, but this is clearly also an element which they highlight, etc. So it has deprived So their point is basically that this first mover disadvantage in Europe has deprived Europe of the dynamic reallocation, notably labor, highly innovative, leading edge activities, startups, spin-offs, etc. Basically the whole line of Draghi, but much broader and large, including the aspects of the geography and so their main point is Europe's small urban scale a cause of its weak first mover innovation. And that I would add to what Adrian just mentioned, because it's an additional feature. We do have very limited ecosystems of the size of the US. And particularly in this digital area, this seems to be a very important issue. Or alternatively, and I come back to the points also made by Emmanuel, is it simply the single market deficit in this area, in particular in the digital area? So this is the figure which is shown in that paper, which is still fascinating because it's simply the R&D figures which they distribute between firms which they call legacy firms and firms who are in this digital area, as they call it, the sort of dynamics of the digital revolution. And the fascinating feature is to see how Europe is not present at all in there, except for a few, some of which are actually on this table here, etc. So this is really why I would love to go back. This was my second point in the comments on Adrian's paper, to go back to the previous period, 75-2000. And if you remember still the RIM, the BlackBerry, maybe I'm too old for those of you who, well, Frederick might knows, and a couple of others who used the BlackBerries, etc. before. Remember, of course, on RIM and the BlackBerry, Netflix made a movie, so I will not go into that detail. But I would just to highlight Nokia's feature, which was, of course, you cannot consider how important Nokia was at the time, developing the GSM 2G as the European standard, which became the global world's standard. Nokia, who has really had 3 billion users, who had revenues which rose in a very short period to 31 billion, who was the world's largest mobile phone manufacturer. And then what happened was basically, you could say, Nicola, nearly an Adrian story. It moved part of its research activities elsewhere. Now, the opposite story about the one you highlighted with respect to Mistral, but here, really, if you look at it, even in 2007, and Nokia was still dominant by far, had 62.5% of the market share, while Microsoft Windows had only 11%, BlackBerry had 11% also. And then you see how things move. And this is, of course, the issue. Is it the geography, or is it basically, in this case, as Stefan Elop put it, the war of the ecosystems and the war of the network systems, which dominated completely and led to the winner takes all in a situation where Windows, of course, the Windows Phone became the operating system on its smartphones. And finally, of course, the agreement between Elop and the Microsoft boss, then the Steve Ballmer, and then Microsoft, of course, took over basically the whole Nokia infrastructure, and Nokia itself merged with Bell Labs and has now moved. And as you know, it's building this new enormous building, the Helix building, where they will be located. But in the meantime, what this picture doesn't tell you is that they have only now no longer production units in Bochum, in Romania, in the various other places where they had elaborated and lost more or less the whole manufacturing site, and have basically 3 research labs, one in Finland, nowhere else in Europe, one, of course, in New Brunswick, and the other one in China. This leads me to the other example, which is, of course, the ASML example, which is to some extent exactly the opposite, you could say, of NXP. And remember here again, the semiconductor industry, where Europe, of course, had the first framework program was the microelectronics framework program, and consisted of the 12 companies making something which were in those days called microelectronics, and were involved, and was an initiative of Philips and Siemens at the time, together with the European Commission. And basically what you find is that Infineon is the only remaining element of Siemens in semiconductors, whereas NXP came out of Philips and is the only remaining semiconductor. So it led to ASML, and let me conclude on this. the fascinating story about ASML is precisely this geographical proximity and the ecosystem. It is really an example whereby ASML produced, of course, so this continues the debate. It doesn't have the economies of scale of a one system. It produces, say, 100, 200 machines, that's it. And each of these machines are very much specific and cost a fortune, of course, but they contain what I've called here intellectual dark matter, tacit knowledge, idiosyncratic skills, unwritten rules, which means that it is the suppliers which are essential in terms of the knowledge, and basically how they maintain that knowledge is basically by accompanying every product they sell with tacit knowledge and with actually the skills, etc. So local supplies are essential to this. Thanks. Sorry.
Thank you, Luc. So I guess we have a consensus here. Geography matters. So now I'd like to open the second round of questions. Is this good idea leads to good solutions when it comes to competition law enforcement? Elaborating on two aspects, maybe. The first one would be merger control. Should we change something in merger control to take into account this? And the second area would be on non-compete obligations. Since we need interaction, since we need mobility of workers, should we prohibit that kind of obligations? On the first question, may I ask Willem what he thinks about this possibly an evolution of merger control? Do you think that merger control should, for instance, block an acquisition because it is going to rob innovation out of Europe or destroy a cluster that we already have in Europe? Is it the type of consequences you have in mind? Or do you see other counterproductive sides of this idea?
Yes, I might. I mean, I'm coming to this from a non-European perspective, so I can give you a sense in terms of what has happened here in South Africa, which is that our Competition Act or merger control pursues two goals or two sets of goals. The one is the traditional competition goal, and the other set is a set of what is known as public interest goals, or which is non-competition objectives, which includes things like sectoral competitiveness, advancing certain, supporting the development of smaller businesses, and the like. And the experience over the past 20 years during which we have come to rely more heavily and increasingly more heavily on these public interest assessments in merger control is that they've become quite dominant. And so what you see is that the competition aspects of mergers that might not raise competition concerns ordinarily are subject to a set of kind of, or considered to be contra to certain public interest objectives, and then that leads to a set of remedies being imposed or required of the merging parties, so that typically to commit to support local value chains or the development of local suppliers, or maybe further downstream in the value chain that's affected by the transaction, or to support small businesses or the like. So the great danger in a competition policy that is pursuing two things at the same time, as we know for many years since Jan Tinbergen's famous arguments around it, is that you might not achieve either objective if you're trying to do both competition and innovation. That, of course, assumes the two are not compatible. So I recognize that. So if it comes to innovation in particular, and the whole conflict discussion here is about dynamic competition, of course, very well aligned with innovation objectives. But it is certainly, I mean, there is a question there and how far you are willing to go, and whether you are in cases where a transaction might not be harming innovation or reducing innovation, whether you want some kind of a positive requirement on the merging parties, which seems quite onerous, to pursue, to support broader innovation efforts or support the ecosystem or the cluster. So it is the types of remedies, including what we call supplier development funds, where the merging parties contribute significant amounts of in terms of the transaction value money to the fund to help support broader industry development efforts. I think that's the route that has been taken here. But there is also the route, as has been advocated for a long time, is that you rather broaden the competition concept itself and to think it and deal with it from the competition angle. But it seems that one would have to be very careful in terms of how these two legs potentially of merger control have to work together. And that does not necessarily have, it's so clear. I mean, if you have, who's going to be affected most, you might have some perverse situations where local, how do you think of local buyers and local targets combining versus, and the discussion here is more about international acquirers concern and the local target. But what is the actual innovation metric that you're worried about? Is it the quality of innovation? Is it and if I can give you a very brief summary of what happened in a recent tech merger here, South Africa, which was blocked, which we discussed with Nicholas before as well, is, I mean, the concern, that merger concern was, well, that the acquirer could develop, easily innovate, suppose, and enter the market, but it's just buying up the target to almost because it's easier to enter the market just by means of that. Others would say, well, in this case, if you would allow the transaction, that the acquirer actually was part of a bigger kind of local ecosystem of digital firms. Maybe if you allowed it, you'd actually strengthen that ecosystem. But then the other argument might be, but it seems our authority was more concerned with having more firms doing more innovation. So it's really, I think the discussion must be also what's your innovation metric or target specifically, and how does that relate to ecosystems? Let me leave it there.
Thank you, Willem. Ben or Luc, do you want to comment on that? I have a question. Are you comfortable with this world where an innovative startup an entrepreneur wants to cash out, and a competition agency is going to say, no, you cannot do that because the acquirer is American. You need to sell your business to a European firm. Are you comfortable with that?
So I'm generally very skeptical of the idea of incorporating innovation spillovers into merger control, both in terms of making it more restrictive. So the example Nicolas gave in his op-ed, but also on the flip side, making it like being more lenient in terms of a merger reinforcing local innovation spillovers. I think in the first case, the one Nicolas sketched, I think it's simply the wrong tool. I think we're confounding competition with competitiveness. If we're concerned about a company being acquired by a foreign investor and innovation capabilities potentially moving overseas, that should be a case for FDI screening. And we'll have to think about what should be included in FDI screening and how should we define critical entities. So I think we should have, if at all, we should have a separate instrument here. Then in the second case, there are a number of reasons to be skeptical, but let me maybe just hone in on one. I think potentially we'll have very grave distributional consequences. So if we were to include innovation spillovers as a sort of like out of market efficiencies, we could potentially end up with a firm in, let's say, Amsterdam, really becoming more innovative and that spilling over into its local system, but with potentially, let's say, the rest of the EU funding this, or potentially funding some of these spillovers by having to pay higher rents. So I don't think that's a good trade-off.
Maybe a few words on non-compete obligations, maybe to give us your insight on
sure.
that.
I've always been very skeptical of non-competes. I think, I mean, this Adrian's paper just adds to the long line of evidence that non-competes represent a bad trade-off in protecting firm-specific human capital formation versus effective competition. So I think it's one more reason not to have them. And I think if you look at the experience in California, they are truly not needed.
Yeah. Luc, do you want to comment on this, the consequences to be drawn from this wonderful study about geography in terms of enforcement of competition rules? Do you think we should block mergers where geography comes into play to preserve European clusters, for instance?
Well, I think it's very good to raise this point because it's a fundamental issue. And my line would be, is there a difference between intra-Europe relocation and outside? So I would also put this to Nicolas. If the Commission is supporting with a local member state and a local region, for instance, to name or to not name Silicon Saxony, and is prepared to develop an industrial policy in that area, how is that vis-à-vis the existing semiconductor manufacturers, etc.? How is that going to affect them? I think this is as much an issue. We have in Europe, we have different member states with different tax relief systems on R&D, as you know. We have systems whereby the Commission cannot provide tax relief policies in terms of industrial policies because they are member states surrogative. So I'm very curious to hear also how the hydrogen bank is a very nice example of leveraging, but what is the limit of leveraging? You will do now with the EDB, the Industrial Decarbonization Bank, 100 billion. Now, good luck in terms of leveraging with auctions in a European framework with very different member states and very different. You have the IP case, which are also agreements between member states. So I'm very curious to see how different would be the supranational feature, which you highlighted with Mistral and Apple, with respect to local intra-European delocation effects. Are these effects similar, or are they all received the benediction from being part of strategic autonomy of Europe? Would be fascinating to hear some reactions from my colleagues here.
I think it's a good time to enlarge the discussion. So we have Nicolas, Jonathan, and Emanuele, please.
So if I can say, sorry, Nico. I just want to make one or two clarifications. First, I found the paper from Adrian. I read it and then I heard it today. And I think it's beautiful economics, like, strong intuition, rigorous empirical work, socially relevant findings, and practical implications in merger policy and other tools. Like, this is like beautiful economics. It's also a capability story. So it ties very well to what David and others have been doing here, but it's economics. And so that's why I like the paper. I want to make a couple of points about the law. The law in Europe cares for the welfare of European consumers, not American consumers. This is the basis in the law. And the same about US law, by the way. US antitrust law cares for the consumer welfare of American consumers. So think about it for a minute. Imagine that 5 Encore firms in the Silicon Valley relocate to Europe. What do you think the Americans are going to say about this? This is about national productivity. Right? It's about market structure in the United States. And so should we also do that? I would say a strong yes. So the law focuses decision-making on the welfare of European consumers, not any consumer in the world, and for good reason. And we should probably factor that in and probably remember that. The second thing I want to say, I think I strongly disagree with Ben on that point about FDI. So what is the best instrument? There is nothing more discretionary than FDI screening. It's just like pure fits. There is no evidence, no procedure, no careful study of the welfare trade-offs involved in a transaction. It is absolute executive power with brute force. So the merger system that we have allows for the study of facts and the bringing of evidence, reason and logic, economic argumentation to the decision table. The question, as Pierre will probably say in a minute, is that the merger guidelines do not allow us to look into out-of-market efficiencies. And that's a constraint when you think about these innovation clusters, right? Because you have to think about the spillover benefits to firms that are not even competing with the Encore company, right? So they're not even in a related market in a way, right? So these are the 3 points about the law that I wanted to make.
It's okay.
Yeah, no, it's just to clarify a few things because, Adrian is an excellent scholar in finance and I really like his papers. But, let's talk also about the competition relevance of those results. So the first claim, there are two claims that I strongly disagree. The first is that the DEC merger review doesn't look at R&D and R&D location and investments. I'm very surprised to hear this. I'm not sure how many of you agree with this. The Commission has been the first authority in the world to advance an innovation theory of harm. And Greg is one of the persons that has been working, and I did my first share outside the CET. And now we're working inside the CET on this topic. Dow DuPont, Monsanto, these are cases where the organization of R&D was at the center of the analysis, was critical in leading to the decision. So that has to be, this especially in the innovation crowd is not really understood, I think, and is important. Second, relocation of companies. The Commission has taken a decision in ADNOC Covestro, a merger between ADNOC, that you may know is the fund that manages oil in Emeritus, with Covestro, that is a spin-off of Bayer, where a key part of the decision to open the R&D portfolio and patent portfolio of Covestro, of the post-merger company, was precisely because of the fear of relocation. And we did it in the context of FSR. So that is not something that has not happened. It has happened, and it has happened precisely for the reason that we're discussing, because it is important to account for the relocation of establishments that may disrupt the level playing field internally and the competitiveness of our companies. So this is already something that apparently is not being taken into account in this discussion. Third, relocation of labor. The Commission has investigated Microsoft inflection precisely because of a theory of harm based on acquire, and the possibility that the labor would have been taken out, which has happened in the end because of Illumina Gray, not because we didn't pursue the acquisition, but because from a legal point of view, we couldn't investigate it further. On spillovers and location, in general, CHIPS Act. CHIPS Act is exactly what the Commission has been doing to push for chips in areas that, ASML is an example of companies that has benefited. In merger review, let's talk about spillovers in merger review. Now, first of all, location already discussed. ADNOC Covestro is an example where the importance of spillover has been taken into account, and opening the patent portfolio of the company is precisely to be sure that they stay in Europe. In terms of the consequence of the paper by Adrian for merger policy, that's about spillovers. Spillovers exist before and after merger. This is something that is often overlooked. Spillovers, and now we go back to my view of dynamic competition. My view of dynamic competition is informed by Schumpeter and Arrow. And as far as I know, those are the scholars that have shaped this literature and are leading and Aguillon papers are based on those scholars and developing a growth setting. Now, spillovers tax innovation ex post, post-merger. Spillovers tax Schumpeter. And the reason is that after the merger, you take into account that part of the benefits don't come to you, but go to some outsider. If we don't realize for that, we don't take into account an important anti-competitive consequence of mergers in the presence of spillover. And this is also a reflection that is built on a new research that is conducted at the chief economist team in line of what was done 10 years ago. Finally, on the gigafactories, just to be sure, those 2 points that you raised were those that I made in my slides. Location is important, and unfortunately, it's not clear where they're going to go. And of course, the leading company is missing. Only Mistral seems to be the one that is interested, but for other reasons. But as far as I know, Connect is working precisely to account for these shortcomings, because the consortium you participate in the discussion is not the one that will get, not yet, has not been decided. So even the criteria has not been decided. So let's see what happens. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have Jonathan, then Thibault and Pierre. Short comments, please.
Okay, I'm going to take up Nicola's invitation that we should look at horses rather than models of horses. So I agree that innovation, geography matters, everything is local. But I would be led to the policy conclusion that if Europe wants to close its innovation deficit with the US and especially cultivate startup ecosystems, it should make it as easy as possible for multinationals, irrespective of their home country, to acquire European startups. And let me give you an example from a paper that I have forthcoming with Ron Kivitz at Columbia Business School. We look at the Tel Aviv Innovation Cluster. Their policy there is to make it as easy as possible for multinationals to acquire startups. As a result of that, there are today approximately 435 R&D divisions of US big tech, European big tech firms located in the Tel Aviv, Israel ecosystem. What happens there is you get a flywheel effect where you get VC money coming in based on the expectation that it will usually be monetized through an exit. But talent doesn't necessarily leave. You have serial entrepreneurs who are responsible for a disproportionate share of the startups, and it constantly revolves around in a virtuous cycle. As a result of this, I'll just leave you with one data point. In 2025, in the Israel ecosystem, on a per capita basis, it had the highest VC investment in the world. In absolute numbers, it had more VC investment than any individual European country except the UK. That's a regime that has made it as easy as possible for foreign multinationals to acquire startups. And that is actually because geography is local. Talent mostly likes to stay where it is. So I think that's something to think about.
That's interesting. Thibault, short one.
All right. So I have to say that this conversation is making me really uncomfortable, because I think what's underlining is really a push for protectionism under a different name. And I have two issues with that. The first one, it seems that it is a repeated game. So if you deny a merger because that merger will actually benefit American consumers before European consumers, I could see how in the short term, this is something you may want to do. But if you engage in this kind of policy, then all other jurisdictions will engage in the very same. And as John just illustrated, this would very much be the end of globalization, which has benefited it all, right? So that's the very first issue I have with it. The second one, which is more fundamental, is that a lot of the discussion, I think, is missing the point on giving some context when it comes to competition and innovation. And here I refer to what has been documented many times, which is a decline in the rule of law and democracy. And in this context, I am not sure if you want to give national competition agencies, even the European Commission, with more power to engage in protectionism, or call it differently, self-sovereignty. Because in the end, if you don't even have this idea of the rule of law and multilateralism to actually constrain what they can do, I am not sure we're going to end up in a better position.
Thank you, Pierre. You want to add something?
Well, quite frankly, Thibault, I think I do not imagine competition authorities going into this kind of tit for tat situation. The situation is that they care about their own consumers, and they're going to do it whatever the other ones do it. And I don't think it's a question of kind of overriding democracy. It's just if you could, there's either an inefficiency or an efficiency linked to mergers that has impact in Europe. You look at the facts, you try to evaluate them. I don't see anything wrong or anti-democratic in that. On the other hand, in the current framework, it's going to be very, very difficult because, as I was discussing with my neighbor here, fitting this into the restrictive criterion that you cannot really look at out-of-market efficiency kind of almost kills it right now, because going back to this example from the first paper, you've got the innovation. We're not talking about the innovation itself, which is a well-defined market. We could deal with this. You're talking about ideas that are generated in the process of engineering, and that kind of goes to other people. Other people are going to use it to produce products that are in completely different markets. So you're not going to be able to do it on the product market side. Could you twist the innovation market definition to fit it in? You're talking about spillovers. It even is not a market for spillovers. So frankly, you're never going to get our lawyers to agree to that.
Okay, I think we need to stop it. Maybe just
Yeah, I just want to say something for Adrien, because the paper is there to read, but the way to read it is it's not about preventing US firms from acquiring European firms. I'm not at all about that. On the contrary, it's actually saying, well, US firms should acquire European firms if they create R&D labs in Europe.
Oh yeah.
And the example, the sort of story for that is the acquisition of DeepMind by Google, which kept all its assets in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
And Assad is clear on the record that this was a key condition for them.
Christopher, one word.
The problems I see are the role of geography is under-theorized and unquantified. Without the quantifiability, you can't trade off against other welfare considerations flat out within just a simple design. The second problem is if geography isn't the only factor that matters, and we know it's not, it can be VC money, mobility, training mobility, regulatory overhead. You can push geography all you want and still not get the outcomes that matter. And so what strikes me is the salience of geography, I think, is helpful because there's clearly Silicon Valley exists even in a world of internet communications. Yeah. Understanding how it matters and what the complementary assets that have to go with it are essential to incorporate into any analysis of mergers or other things for geography.
Yeah, thank you. Fascinating topics. I would like to thank Willem for joining us online. Thank you, Willem. And please join me in thanking Ben and look for the wonderful panel. Thank you.